Welcome, my name is Colleen Tauke and I'm the sewing specialist here at Fons & Porter. In this Sew Easy, I'm going to show you all about the things you need to do to have the perfect binding on your quilt. The binding is the last chance you have to finish off that edge and make your quilt spectacular. So here are some steps you can take. We are beginning with the cutting of our binding, and traditionally binding is cut anywhere from 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 inches wide. Refer to the pattern that you're using because the yardage has been configured for the size that they're requesting. So go according to that for what the designer suggests for the width. Ours in our magazines will vary from 2 1/4 to 2 1/2, which is very traditional. What you're going to be doing is cutting the number of strips that are required in your pattern, and if you're designing on your own, what you need to do is to total up the entire perimeter, all the numbers that go the length and width of your quilt, add those all together and add about 24 inches. That gives you enough to do your joining of pieces together to make enough binding for your quilt. It also allows for some of that, the part that gets comes up in the binding of the corners doing the miters. So about another 20 to 24 inches added to that total perimeter of your quilt. Now you're going to have pieces of binding that you need to join together, and in order to do that, you're going to be marking a diagonal across your binding because it's going to be a stitching line. You're going to join the pieces end to end. Some people will actually join them just flush like this, the straight. The problem is that when you do that, when you actually apply the binding and then roll it, you get a lot of thickness in one spot. So what we suggest is you sew at a 45-degree angle and join that way, kind of dispersing the seam allowances through the binding. And my favorite thing to do is just to go in and mark that 45-degree line across your the end of a piece of binding, and then I can easily place them right sides together. And you always want to double check to make sure that you've placed it right, because if I were to open this up, it's not going to be in the right position. So what you need to do is turn it around, make sure that you have that when you stitch that diagonal, when you open it up, you're going to make a straight line. That little quick check to see if you've got it placed right save you a lot of headache and a little bit of time taking things out. Sometimes we reverse sew, but not too often. We like to try to avoid that. Now, making sure that you have aligned so your stitching will go right from where the two pieces join there to the intersection of those two pieces there. I have a walking foot on my sewing machine so that when we actually attach the binding, we're ready to go, but it can be used to join your binding also. We've got the needle in the center position. We're going to be following a line, so we don't really need to worry about our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and join the pieces together. Now while I'm doing this, and I'm probably going to be adding like 6 or 7 for a large quilt, I'll just take the next end. This is the top one. Lay it on the bottom, take my next piece of binding that has that marking and just keep putting them through and have them all chained together. Then we can take it to the ironing board. Once we've got that stitched and ready to go, we need to press to make sure that we have a nice flat binding. So we're going to go over to the ironing board. Always, just as in patchwork, heat set your fabric first, your fibers, and then open it up. Open the seam and press that. Now we need to remove that excess triangle underneath there. So we're trimming away, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Very similar kind of thing that when you do diagonal seams in a process in your patchwork, very similar kind of thing of taking that away, that excess fabric underneath. Now we have a nice clean join. You'll notice that these outside edges are parallel if you've got them aligned properly. Now you need to take it back to the iron and you need to press the entire length of your binding in half, matching the cut edges along the long sides so that you have your binding all prepared to put onto your quilt. Now I have one all pressed and ready to go. And sometimes it gets to be great that you can kind of hide your seaming in there. So this is where the join is at. It is pressed and neat and tidy and ready to be applied to the quilt. I've got a small piece of a kind of a mini quilt that we can demo on here. And now there are two different groups of thought. Some people prefer to leave their batting and their backing fabric long. And in this case, I've trimmed mine. I like to drag the least amount of fabric through my sewing machine as possible. So I trim and leave just a little bit of batting, showing the backing and the batting are just a little longer than the quilt top itself. That will fill the binding when we're done. So as you wrap your binding around, there'll be something inside, it won't be hollow. Now, for the beginning and placement of your binding, usually want to start somewhere along the side of a quilt. Try not to start into the corner because then you have to deal with your miter and your joining and everything. It's easiest to back up a ways and start somewhere along a side of a quilt when you start to apply your binding. Now, what you want to do is leave a tail anywhere from 6 to 8 inches or so in length that will be free. It won't be actually attached to your quilt. This will give you room to maneuver when you're trying to join the ending and the beginning together. So that give yourself that much of a tail at the beginning. Now, I'm going to be placing my binding along the edge of my quilt top. You can see the batting there extending beyond. And I'll start approximately about here, and I'll stitch to the corner. When we approach the corner, then I'll take it out and I'll show you how to get that perfect miter on your quilt. Like I said, this is your last chance to do that really nice finish for your quilt. And binding is kind of like putting a picture frame on a project. So we're running a 1/4 inch seam. Now this is a dual feed foot. It's a little bit larger on this kind of machine. Sometimes you have a walking foot. It's about half the size of this, but they work in the same way. What they're doing is helping to feed the fabric, both the top layer, the binding, and the quilt sandwich through the machine so that you don't get distortion in the process of stitching. We're going to stop about a 1/4 inch from the edge of our quilt top. We're going to take it, cut the thread, take it out of the machine, and you can see I've stitched, there's the edge of my quilt top here. I've stopped about a 1/4 inch short. Now what I'm going to do, position this, is take the binding and I'm going to fold it up and back away off the quilt, and then I'm going to fold it back toward myself. And I have a fold along this outer edge. Now if I pull that back really close and I make a perfect corner here, it's going to be a little bit tight. When I go to roll it around to the back side to stitch it, I'm going to end up with a dimple in the corner or in the miter. So the suggestion from someone who taught me well was to leave just a little bit, be a little bit sloppy. Don't pull it really tight. Just leave it a little bit extending beyond the edge of your binding here. See how that extends? Just even 1/8 of an inch will be just enough to get a perfect miter and a perfect corner. The other thing is that if you folded it properly, you should have like a little, almost like a triangle shaped sail here at the top. So we're going to lay it down, take it under the machine, and stitch going down the second side of the quilt. Now I'm going to start my stitching right along at that fold that goes off the edge, so that I'm stitching all the way down the side. And I would continue until I got to within 1/4 of an inch of the next corner on my quilt. I'll stitch just a little bit here so you can see how that's going to look. Whoops. Press our foot up. There we go. And now you can see I started at the very edge of the binding. I did my 1/4 inch and I would just continue down that side and repeat that process. So then when I would open this up, let's take a peek at what the miter is going to look like when we get there. You can start to see how that perfect mitered corner is going to appear all the way nice and full out to the corner. Okay, so repeat that process. Let's fold another piece here. Just repeat that process. Stitched within 1/4 inch of the quilt top, flip it up, back down, leave just a little extra at the end, and continue down the next side of the quilt. Okay, we've got that process down. Now, when we get all the way around our quilt top, we have to join the ends together. We've got that opening that we started with the tail on both ends. Our corners are all complete, so we've got everything done except this last little spot. So we need to kind of close the gate. So we're taking the pieces that we had, and we're going to find somewhere in the center of this opening, we're going to fold our binding pieces back. And we're going to leave about 1/4 of an inch of a gap. If I put the ruler on there, you can see that's about 1/4 inch gap between those folds. I'm going to kind of finger press the fold because I want to be able to know where that fold is once I open it up. And when I mean open it up, I mean unfold it here. Now you can see I've already marked this one. I've marked the fold that we just finger pressed. I've marked the fold where the binding was created when we folded it in half and did that pressing. So I've got a crosshatch here. And now what I need to do is put a diagonal in there. And what you need to do is take a ruler that has your diagonal marked, most 6-inch squares or 6.5-inch squares, or even a smaller one if you want, have that diagonal marked. And what you need to do is put that diagonal line along one side of the binding. Make sure that it intersects that crosshair that we did where the pressing was at, and mark a line there, and that's going to be a stitching line. Okay, so we have one side done. We finger press the other side also, so when we open it up, we've got, again, we will mark, and I'm using a water-soluble or heat-soluble marking pen. Don't use a Sharpie, don't use a permanent marker. Use something that will wash away, or you can use with heat to remove the line, because we don't want the line to end up showing. It's just our guidelines. So we're marking that fold that we finger pressed down the center again, and then go in and lay your ruler, that 45-degree line, along the edge of your binding. Make sure that your ruler intersects that crosshair and draw your second line. Now, the real thing you need to look for here is that both of these angles are parallel, because that means they're going to fit together. Okay? Once you have those marked, you're going to take pins and you're going to, this is why we leave this open kind of here. It's going to fold it up because we kind of want to be able to get these two close together. And we're going to match up our stitching lines. I'm going to kind of fold that so I know where my stitching line is there and the stitching line over here. Now this is where kind of pin matching comes into play. I want to match my centers, so I'm going to put a pin in that crosshair, and then I'm going to come over here. I'm going to find the other one. Just like when you're putting patchwork together and you want perfect points, that matching kind of thing. Okay, so we're putting the pin in there and we'll pull it all the way down so we know those are right on top of each other. And then I can kind of swing, and hopefully, if my diagonal's laying there properly, that diagonal line is coming right to the edge of my binding. If I were to pretend that I had stitched this, I should be able to check that the lines, oh, look at that. The lines overlapped exactly. That's my stitching line. So now I'm going to take out my little pole, because it's done its work. I've got those lines matched up, but if I stitch with the pins in that position, I'm going to run into them, correct? So I'm going to hold everything together. I'm going to reposition my pins so that I can stitch over them safely, or as I approach them, take them out. Okay, now let's take it under the sewing machine. This is why you want to pin everything in place, because you don't want it to shift as you're moving to the machine. And you probably will have a larger quilt than this, but since you have that gap, you can kind of fold it up and make it nice and neat and bring it to the sewing machine. Then we're going to stitch right on that line so that we are joining our binding pieces together nice with a diagonal seam, which again will reduce that bulk. Get to the end. Now we want to check before we trim anything. And see, as I open that, it's just popping into place. And I've got long tails. I'm going to leave those until I've double checked everything. And once I lay it down, see, that's going to be perfect. So now all I need to do is take a scissors. I can come in here and I can trim those long tails. Let's fold that over. There we go. Perfect. Now I can trim away and leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Like that. Tails go away. I'm going to come in here, and I could use the nose of my iron. I can also just finger press this. It's going to lay down so nicely once I let go of this. It'll pop right into place. See how that worked? Now I simply go in with a 1/4 inch seam and just finish off my attaching my binding to my quilt. And then I have it perfect. Now, the last thing we need to do is address how to create the corners, how to stitch those, because that and attaching the back or getting the binding around to the back side of your quilt is your last little finish. So needle and thread, I'm using red. On this normally you would probably want to use a cream or a turquoise, but I'm using red so you can see what I'm doing. Start anywhere along the back of your quilt and you're going to roll your binding to the back side. Now the proper placement, when you think about it, is that this fold should come right to the red line so that you have the even amount of binding to the front and to the back. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to lodge my knot into the seam allowance there, fold the binding around to that line, stitching line. I'm going to take just a little bite into the fabric. Then I'm going to, get that out there a little more, take a bite into the backing of my quilt, right along that red stitching line and into that fold. And it just needs to be a tiny little bite. It's kind of an invisible seam stitching kind of thing. And your stitching needs to be anywhere from about 3/8 to or smaller in your stitches. The reason why we suggest a small stitch like that is to make sure that nothing catches and pulls your binding loose on your quilt. If you take long stitches, you might end up what we call toe catchers, and you might catch a fingernail or a toe on the edge of your binding and then pull it loose. So small stitches into the backing and that are parallel to your stitching where you put the binding on, then that tiny bite into the fold will make a nice, neat, and almost invisible stitching there. Now, as we approach the corner, I'm taking a little bite into the backing there, right up to the L-shape stitching that I put the binding on, and then I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go in here and fold my miter. Now, if the batting is a little bit thick there, what you can do is go in and diagonally snip away the batting. Make sure you just have the batting in the backing, but snip away that little extra on the corner. It will help reduce the bulk a little bit. And this one's already clipped. What we need to do is you've been stitching along here. It's making a nice fold here. What you need to do is get around the corner. So we're taking this binding and we're folding it down. And if it's done properly, you'll get that perfect little miter on the back side. Take a stitch right into the fold. You want to nail down that corner. So take a couple of stitches right there on the corner. This is why matching thread kind of comes into play. It's nice to have something that you don't see your stitches too much. Then go into the miter itself and take a couple of stitches. I'm also using what I call a straw needle. It's a very fine, long, thin needle, and it helps to make very small stitches. It doesn't make holes in your quilt. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down right beside that miter. I'm going to go straight down so that I can go to the right side of my quilt. Over, and if it's folded like this properly, the needle will come up right beside the fold on the front. I'm going to take just a couple little stitches to close the miter on the front side of my quilt. 2 little stitches is probably all you'll need to do to close that miter up. I'm going to take my last stitch going straight down, back to the back side. I can kind of direct that tip so it's right into the fold again. As I pull it down, you've closed the miter on the front, you've closed the miter on the back. I can take a little jump stitch over to the side here. So I'm in position to go down the next side of my quilt and finish my binding all the way around. Perfect finish on a perfect quilt. If you'd like to see more of our Sew Easy techniques, please visit our website. Thanks for joining me today.